It is with great pleasure this morning and respect that I introduce Dr. Leith Anderson to you. I first became associated with Leith when I was on the national board of the denomination, and we served together on the board of trustees at Bethel University. Leith was a senior pastor at Wooddale Church for 35 years. During that time, the Wooddale family grew to include 9 daughter churches and even granddaughter churches. Leith is currently pastor emeritus at Wooddale. Among other accomplishments, Leith is a respected seminary teacher who regularly addresses evangelical concerns with local and national elected officials. While at Wooddale, his nationally syndicated radio programs Faith Matters and Faith Minute were heard across America and around the world. Leith has authored over 20 books. Since retiring as senior pastor at Wooddale, Leith has directed his efforts towards National Association of Evangelicals and was unanimously named president of NAE in 2007. Leith has been indirectly involved with Discovery Church for many years. Art was actually a student of Leith's at Denver Seminary. Several years ago, a number of our church leaders attended a seminar at Wooddale Church on church growth. Leith offered his expertise and insight on church growth and actually consulted on the site selection for this location. Leith is joined with his wife, Charlene. Charlene and Leith have been side by side in ministry for virtually all of their lives. The Andersons have 4 children. They split their time between their home in Eden Prairie and their home in Nisswa, Minnesota. We are very honored to have such a distinguished Christian leader here to help celebrate this very, very special occasion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leith Anderson.
Thank you, Ron. Well, actually, I'm honored. I'm honored to be able to worship with you today, and especially to join in the celebration, the congratulations, the honoring of Art and Judy in 20 years of ministry at Discovery Church. And as Raleigh has indicated, your story and my story have connected in different ways through the years. I've been friends with many of your pastors over the last half century, friends within the congregation of the church, shared in the examination of sites around the St. Cloud area that finally settled on this location for this building. And and with Art, we first got to know each other at Denver Seminary. That was a long time ago. It was actually another century, to tell you the truth. It was way back when. But there's a personal side to all this that I just want to mention, and that is that our home is in Eden Prairie. We have a cabin north of Brainerd, and for many years we drove there on Highway 10 past the old site of the church. And then when 15 was open, we switched, and we came this way by the new site for Discovery Church. So we drive by this building many, many weeks throughout the year and always talk about Discovery Church, often pray specifically for you and for the church, and just love the connection. So these are stories, and stories that interconnect. We all have our stories, and we love to tell our stories, and we love to hear the stories of others. The master storyteller was Jesus. He could mesmerize a crowd. He could antagonize a critic. He could confound theologians, and he could draw thousands of people, all with the same story. At the same time, he would be funny and simple and profound, and would teach a moral as well. So his parables, they are well known to those of us in the 21st century, and they were identified with people in the first century as well. We sort of see ourselves in the stories, the parables of Jesus. One of the most famous is a story that you probably know well. It's near the end of the first gospel of the New Testament in Matthew 25. Last week, Art's preached from Matthew 26, so this week we move a little bit earlier into Matthew 25. It's the story of a very rich man who decided to go away on a journey, and he gathered 3 of his employees together to ask them to steward a fortune, maybe his fortune or a part of his fortune, while he was gone. And the most famous line in this story is one that is quoted often, and that is, "Well done, good and faithful servant." But it's kind of the least quoted line in this story of Jesus that most intrigues me. So the story begins with Jesus saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like this, like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, to another 1 talent, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received the 5 talents went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. So also the one who had 2 talents gained 2 more, but the man who had received the 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money." Okay, so we hear a story like this, and I think probably we imagine ourselves in it, and we wonder how we would rate in this rating system from 1 to 5. What number would the boss give to us? Maybe we try to imagine what it would be like to have a lot of money that belonged to somebody else that we would care for. Maybe if we're thinking about ourselves, we're beginning to say, well, you know, if you're an investment manager, you get a percentage. You ought to get at least 1% per year. So what's 1% of whatever this amount of money was? And how much is a talent anyway? Which is a really good question. And a talent was both a measure of weight and a measure of money. And it's really difficult to translate money from an ancient culture into a modern economy and figure out exactly what it would be. Our best estimate is that a talent was about 80 pounds. But we don't know for sure what this was. It might have been silver. If it was silver, it was a lot of money. If it was gold, it was an extraordinary amount of money. So for those of you who are far better at math than I am, maybe you already know that 80 pounds, translated into the weight for silver and gold, is 1,167 troy ounces. And because I assume you are all investors in these things, you are certainly well aware of what the market price was on the commodity market this past week, right? For silver and for gold. You probably looked it up this morning. And actually, if it was silver, a talent of silver in today's money would be about $19,000. So it was a lot of money. If it was gold, a talent would be, in today's money, about $1.5 million. It was really a lot of money. But then you think, well, you know, they didn't buy iPhones and cars, and they didn't fly in airplanes, and so how do you figure money for them compared to money for us? So there's another way of doing it, and that is to use their coinage, which was a denarius, or denarii in plural, and a talent was 6,000 denarii. And a denarius was typically the wage that was paid for a labor, the typical labor in first century Israel. So that's to say that a talent of a denarius, denarii, was 6,000. Well, it's an extraordinary number of days of work. If silver, it was 20 years of a laborer's income. But Jesus was talking about 5 talents. So that would be income for 100 years. 100 years of a laborer's pay. But if it was gold, now you're talking 8,200 years of income. And if it was doubled, then you're talking 16,000 years of income. All right, so this is the time of year when we work on income tax returns. And if there's any time when you may have a really good idea of what your income was last year in 2018, just multiply, quickly in your head by 16,000. And I mean, it's just a breathtaking amount of money that Jesus is talking about here. It exceeded the entire budget of whole Roman provinces in the Roman Empire. So you got to figure that Jesus was sort of playing with their imagination. I mean, these were people that couldn't ever have seen that amount of money. So to hear the story and to put themselves into it, their hearts must have been beating faster. Their imagination must have soared. It's like the person that imagines an exceptional inheritance or winning the lottery or something where you have an amount of money that you've never in your life ever seen or imagined or dreamed of or whatever. So the boss in the story decides to allocate on the basis of the boss's assessment of the abilities of these different employees. They were managers of somebody else's money, and that meant that they had to calculate, if the boss was there, how would the boss have dealt with this kind of cash? Was the boss a high-risk person in business or a low-risk person? Because they were managers of something that belonged to somebody else, and they had to do it the way the boss would want it done if the boss had been there. And you know what happened. Two of them invested the money and doubled what it was. One of them took a cautious approach. He buried it. He didn't even keep up with inflation. He had no return on the investment that was entrusted to him. Okay, but I said it's one of the least quoted and least noticed lines in this parable of Jesus that most intrigues me. It's in Matthew 25:19. It says, Jesus says, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. So my prayer, I actually prayed this, is that every one of you as part of Discovery Church, everyone as a follower of Jesus Christ, may someday actually hear Jesus say, good job, well done with everything that I've entrusted to you. But it takes a long time. It's the investment that can be an entire lifetime. It takes a long time to raise a family. It takes a long time to get a degree. It takes a long time to build a business. It takes a long time to build a building. It takes a long time to lead a church. It takes a long time to raise children. It takes a long time to manage what God has entrusted to us. It's a story throughout the Bible. Moses is remembered as the great lawgiver who led the escape of the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt and into the promised land. But remember, it was 80 years getting ready before he ever began the process of getting them out of Egypt. 80 years getting ready. Or the biography of Jesus, it covers 33 years. 90% of that, 30 years of Jesus' life was just preparation. That was a long time. But in those last 3 years, he changed the history of all of eternity. So Discovery Church started on Christmas Day, 1855. I mean, it is so cool for a church to have a shared birthday with Jesus. I mean, I can't think of anything any better than that. I mean, that's totally impressive. So this is year number 164. That means multiple locations. It means different pastors. It means a lot of new members since 1855. Well, I'm assuming you're all new members since 1855. I don't know. And some of you might have been here. No, that's not even possible. Art Cotant has served as the pastor of this congregation for 20 years at a time when the typical tenure of a pastor in the United States is 6 years. He's been here 20 years. So this congregation has been really good at the long time that Jesus talks about in this parable. Your pastor has been really good at this long time stewardship of what God has entrusted. Because you see, it's comparatively easy to be faithful for the short term. I mean, there's something exhilarating about starting something new and the initial adventure. But we realize that God has called us to a marathon, not to a sprint. And to be sure, faithfulness is not just waiting out the calendar. It's not just flipping the pages from month to month and year to year. No, faithfulness is doing it the way the boss would do it. It's how it's done as much and more than how long it's done. Faithfulness is serving God. It's not just the results. Faithfulness is consistency that is maintained over the long term. It's sort of like, putting the seatbelts on in your car. You can't just do it 80% of the time. You need to do it all the time. You need to be consistent because you don't know what the road circumstances are going to be. Faithfulness is not quitting when it gets hard. And when you do something for a long time, inevitably it gets hard. It's taking this long view, aiming at a lifetime and not just the moment. So investment advisors will say, if you're really interested in doing it right by an investment, you're talking about a lifetime. And over a lifetime, there are ups and downs. There are feasts, and there are famines, and there are floods, and there are droughts. There are the best of times, and there are the worst of times. There are surprises that come along the way for a long time, things you would never have predicted or anticipated. Beyond imagination, and now you're into it, and you've got to make a decision, and you've got to manage it, and you've got to handle it. That's what faithfulness is like over a long, long time. So I served as a pastor of Wooddale Church in Eden Prairie for most of my life. And I have some memories of some early years there that were difficult. At least I thought they were at the time. But let me sort of fast forward out of that century into this century. So for a while, in addition to pastoring in the Twin Cities, I also served as the president of Denver Seminary and commuted to Denver every week. It was on a return flight, Charlene was with me, that we would take the last flight back between Denver and Minneapolis. I was tired. It had been a long day at the office, at the seminary, and all that was going on. And she was seated at the window. I was seated at the aisle. And honestly, I was practically asleep before the plane took off, just tired. The flight attendant that was in our part of the airplane was busily getting everything ready to go. And she walked past us, and she was sort of hurrying, as I recall, but she stopped, and she turned to Charlene and looked at her and said, "Are you reading my favorite book?" And Charlene, I think, caught by surprise, looked back at her and said, "It's a Bible." And the flight attendant said, "I know the author," and then just went on with getting everything ready for the flight to take off. So it was maybe half an hour later. The plane was quiet. The overhead lights were turned out. A few had their reading lights on, but kind of everybody was tired. And the flight attendant came back, and she knelt down in the aisle next to our row. And the two women engaged in a conversation there together. And honestly, I was just kind of listening, but really not. And she's sort of telling her story, and it was very evident that she was a committed Christian. And in the course of the conversation, she said that she lived in Loveland, Colorado. And Charlene said, "Well, we used to live in Colorado." And then the flight attendant said, "Well, where do you live now?" And Charlene said, "We live in Eden Prairie, Minnesota." And flight attendant said, "I used to live in Eden Prairie." And then Charlene said, "Well, when you lived in Minnesota, where did you go to church?" And she said, "I went to Wooddale Church, and I can still remember the sermons from when I was there." And I was starting to find this a much more interesting conversation where this was going to go. So I'm sort of perking up, and I looked at Charlene, and I gave her the look. And I should explain that she and I have known each other all of our lives. It seems strange to me that couples have met. We have never met. We've known each other since birth, started dating the month I turned 15, been married most of our lives. There isn't really that much to talk about anymore. I mean, seriously, we walk through the mall, and one of us will say, wow, he really looks like, and the other one said, yeah, he really does. Because, we know all the same people, we've gone to the same schools, our parents knew each other, we grew up in the same church. So I gave her the look, which I thought she would get. So she either didn't understand the look or whatever, and she turns to the flight attendant and says, you need to know, he's the pastor at Wooddale Church. Okay, she's on her knees in the aisle, 18 inches from my face. She looks at me and she says, no, this was 25 years ago when Leith Anderson was the pastor at Wooddale. Okay, so you saw the video, and Art looks like he did 20 years ago. I grant you that, and congratulations. But that did not work for me, all right? I mean, 25 years, it sort of took its toll on my face and life. And anyway, I mean, this is probably stupid, but I actually did it. I reached in my pocket, took out my wallet, took out my Minnesota driver's license, and showed it to her to prove that my wife actually knows who she is married to. I mean, it seemed like... And then she told us the rest of her story. And the rest of her story was that when she was a rookie flight attendant for Northwest Airlines, she had a really long layover in the Minneapolis airport. And she didn't want to stay at the terminal, so she went out to her car. I think she was completely unchurched. It was a Sunday morning, and she just started driving around. And she saw a church building. And she decided to park her car, and she came in. And she said she sat in the back. And then she said, I listened to the sermon, and that morning I decided to follow Jesus, and I've never turned back. And then she talked about marrying a godly Christian husband, the church that they're involved in Loveland, Colorado. Talked about how she shares her faith with passengers and other crew members, how she leads a Bible study for other flight attendants. An extraordinary story of stellar Christian discipleship. And it was all rooted in something I didn't know anything about. At a time when, I was kind of discouraged. And I didn't find out about any of this for 25 years. Because it takes a long time. It takes a long time to find out what God is fully doing in our lives. John Quincy Adams was the son of the second president of the United States, and he became the sixth president of the United States. If you check out his biography, you find out that in many ways he was an extraordinary man. He was the United States ambassador to several European countries. He served as the Secretary of State of the United States of America. He negotiated and settled the treaties that established the United States-Canadian border and that established the annexation of Florida from Spain. He became the president and almost completely paid off the national debt. And when he ran for re-election for a second term, he lost by a landslide. And he did something that no other president before or since has done. And that is, he ran for the House of Representatives from his home state of Massachusetts. And he served in the House of our Congress for 17 years. And during those 17 years, he was an exemplary advocate for abolition. He proposed bills before the Congress to eliminate slavery. He argued cases before the United States Supreme Court. He gave speeches. He came up with what some people consider to be bizarre ideas on how to stop slavery in this nation. One of his crazy ideas, they said, was that someday the country may actually go to war over this, and that there will be a civil war, and if that ever happens, whoever is then the president of the United States will have a War Powers Act where it would be at least theoretically legal and possible for the then president to unilaterally free the slaves without the consent of the Congress. After 17 years serving in the House, He died in the speaker's room right off the rotunda. You can go when you visit Washington. The House used to meet in the rotunda, and his body was taken to the speaker's room. And a committee of arrangements was set up to honor him and to accompany his body back for a funeral in Massachusetts. There was a one-term member of the House of Representatives whom Adams had only known for a year, and he was appointed to that committee of arrangements. He had had a great influence, Adams had, on this representative from Illinois' 7th District. The two congressmen had served together for less than a year, but he had profoundly influenced the 39-year-old from Illinois who became the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. And there was a Civil War. And he had extraordinary powers under the War Powers Act. And Abraham Lincoln did what John Quincy Adams imagined someday a president would do. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation to set the slaves free. Adams had been dead for 14 years. It took a long time. In Adams' case, it took more than a lifetime. So, fellow Christians, we're in this for the distance. God has entrusted to you extraordinary gifts. God has entrusted this church with an extraordinary pastor and congregation. Unprecedented opportunities. Not with a promise that anything will be easy, but with the guarantee that God will go along. Because unlike the boss in the parable, God does not go away some distance and then come back and check with no communication in between. We have a God who walks with us through all of these experiences. The God who is with us through adolescence and adulthood and advanced age, and in marriage and in parenting, and in work and in church and school and health and sickness. And it takes a long time. And God is faithful to us, absolutely faithful. Even when we're unfaithful to him, God remains faithful to us. He never abandons us. He's always with us. And he calls us to be faithful to him. And after a long time, God comes seeking to say, good job. Well done. Every 4 years for the summer Olympic Games, and I think just about without fail, since 1968, there is a story that is retold at least every 4 years. Sometimes with whole-page ads telling the story, like in USA Today and other publications. The 1968 Summer Games were held in Mexico City, and that introduced a significant issue because of the high altitude, because the athletes who gathered from around the globe had trained at lower altitudes, many of them at sea level, and the higher altitude made it much more difficult for them to compete, especially in the marathon. So in 1968, there were 75 countries that entered runners into the marathon. Of the 75 who started the race, 57 finished the race. These are the best runners in the world. There was a 34% dropout. Mama Wolde of Ethiopia won the gold medal in 1968. He won it at 2 hours, 20 minutes, 16 seconds. The last runner came in more than an hour later at 3 hours, 25 minutes, 27 seconds. He was John Stephen Akwari of Tanzania. When he finally crossed the finish line, the stadium was virtually empty. Pretty much everybody had left. But a reporter who had stayed to the very end of the race came up to him and asked him a question. And the question was, why didn't you quit the race when you were injured? Because he had fallen, his leg had bled significantly, and he had dislocated his knee joint. And he kept running. He kept running. So I was asked, why did you not quit the race when it was so hard? John Stephen Akwari answered, my country, Tanzania, did not send me 10,000 miles just to start the race. My country, Tanzania, sent me 10,000 miles to finish the race. God has called each of us to live out faith for Jesus Christ, for the marathon, for the long race. God has called us for a long time because he trusts us. He's blessed us. He has given us opportunities, and God expects the very best from you. So that in 5 or 10 or 20 or 50 years, or maybe even after a lifetime, Jesus may say, well done, good and faithful servant. God has sent you not only to start the race, but to finish the race for Jesus Christ. Please stand. Let's pray together. God our Father, how thankful we are that you are our God, and through Jesus Christ, we are your followers, we are your servants, we are yours. For each one here, I pray that whatever the gifts, the talents that have been entrusted may be well managed, and faithfully may you be served. Sometimes in the best of times, and sometimes in the most difficult of circumstances. We celebrate this church and this pastor this day in a special way because of the evidence of faithfulness to you for a long time. And may this long time be built upon for a long time that lasts a lifetime and beyond. Thank you for your blessing. Thank you for these who are faithful. Thank you for what you have done and what you will do. All this we celebrate in the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen.